Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. Really looking forward to our conversation today. Of course, we do understand the importance to many of you in family office conversations of structuring, of taxation, of investing, all very important topics. But I've been saying this for a long time. I've been in the business for 20 years. The greatest threat to families is families. It's internal. It's conflict, it's litigation, kind of not being on the same page. And to me, a lot of that comes down to competency. So today's conversation, we have a very special guest, is on what I think is really an anchor of importance in any generational family. That would be governance and culture in blended families. That's very specific. Let's welcome our special guest today. That would be Valerie Galinskaya, Managing Director, Head of Merrill Center for Family Wealth, Merrill Private Wealth Management. Valerie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela.
It's a pleasure. Been a big fan of your work and, of course, your organization for a long time. And why don't we start, given the context that I set it up, there may be some people that are a little unsure. How would you define a blended family?
Absolutely. So there are a number of definitions, but a blended family is typically when you have two individuals who are making a life together with children from one or both of their prior relationships. So that's the typical definition. And as we think about, how ubiquitous that is today, that was a big reason that we as a team became really interested in understanding what are the unique and sometimes common challenges and opportunities that blended families face.
And I think an important follow-up question to that, to also give the audience context. And again, I'm assuming many of them knew that definition, but it helps to hear it from you, who has written white papers and really focused and doing great work on the subject. Approximately what percentage of families, whether rich or poor, are effectively blended families?
Absolutely. So the family makeup, at least in the U.S., is very much changing. And according to statistics, and certainly the U.S. Bureau of Census, over 50% of U.S. families are remarried or recoupled today. Moreover, 50% of the 60 million children in the U.S. under the age of 13 are currently living with one biological parent and that parent's current partner. So that, coupled with the fact that 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce, about 3/4 of those individuals remarry, shows exactly to the point how common this is and how many families, as you noted, of varying net worth, varying asset levels, are navigating these dynamics.
Wow, that's even greater percentages than I thought. So again, for those of you that are a family member working in a family office or servicing the family office, understanding areas pertaining to blended families and some of the unique challenges. And if you think it's a niche, you just heard, it is not a niche. It's likely over a little bit over 50%. That's incredible. So why don't we start to dive in a little bit? What are some of the unique challenges that blended families face, and which ones do you see most often?
Absolutely. So when we think about, our team works with about 200 families, and a number of whom are blended families, again, in different stages, children of various ages. There are definitely a few patterns and a few common challenges that we see. One being this notion that when there is a blended family, there's really a lack of a shared history in many times, right, to buffer against conflict or uncertainty. And that we found is really, really important, because obviously if you are a family member who, has a tremendous amount of trust, if there are things like misunderstandings or concerns or kind of preconceived notions, that shared history buffers the conflict. And when there's a lack of that, there's a probability, right? This is not true for every individual, but there's a probability of unintended consequences. So that's kind of one, Angela, that we see. Another challenge that, I know will not be surprising to your viewers is kind of this notion of the complexity of the finances, right, tends to increase. When we're talking about blended families, oftentimes there are ex-spouses or ex-partners, there are children. So we're talking about alimony, child support. With higher net worth families, we're talking about maybe trusts, right, generational or not, that have been set up by, for example, one set of grandparents. There's just a number of different structures, guidelines. There are more individuals typically involved, and that often creates, not surprisingly, a tremendous amount of complexity, which frankly can be overwhelming, right, to any of us, and can be overwhelming and really increased by kind of the first comment, right, of not a lack of trust necessarily or shared history. And then the third is the fact that the children in the family, right, whether they're rising generation members, meaning adults, or maybe younger children, that for them, this, oftentimes can be a huge, and often is a huge life change, and they may be receiving different messages, right, from one parent or another, from other family members, and just the impact on communication that can create, and kind of sometimes tension and lack of clarity. So I would say those three, Angela, are the ones that kind of bubble up to the surface.
And thinking at it from my perspective, being focused really on the single family office community, obviously those are going to be families around the world of great wealth. And I absolutely believe the percentages are equally every bit, if not even a little greater, for families at that level. And the challenges that you just noted, again, really they're interfamily dynamics, rich or poor. If anything, it's more amplified. And maybe the stakes are graver in a wealthy family, very wealthy family, but they're still there. If I could talk a little bit or get your opinion, a little bit on what I've learned from families that are incredibly successful, that often go back multiple generations. They're very big on culture. We have a culture. We're on the same page. We're rowing together, a bunch of analogies that we could all use. I am assuming it gets a little more complicated, not only with married in, period, but let alone blended families. How does a family of great wealth from the top on down retain its culture, but also remain open that times are changing, they need to adapt, and maybe what worked 10 or 20 years ago is not going to work as well in today's world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, Angela, that you said culture, because in our experience working with blended families and ultra high net worth blended families in particular, it is exactly that. It's this question of how do you create a new family culture? How do you do it intentionally? And we often like to say, and kind of we term this in our white paper, kind of this notion of creating a new operating system. And we use that word intentionally because in many ways, family culture is similar to software. It's running in the background, it's informing the patterns and oftentimes unconscious beliefs that the family operates under. So from our experience in working with blended families and kind of observing this for many, many years, it really comes down to understanding that it's the families that are intentional around saying, what is our family culture? What do we want it to be in this new family, are ones that are ultimately the most successful. And when I say successful, to qualify that, right, are successful in achieving whatever is important to that. Now, the natural next question is, how do you do that? That all sounds great, but let's get, let's get a little practical. So for us, there are kind of a few factors, and I'm happy kind of to dig into these as you'd like. One is kind of this notion, and this I would say is not necessarily unique to blended families, but it is really critical, we found, to partners, right? Spouses, partners, what have you. And it's this notion of one saying, what are my money stories as an individual, and what are my partner's money stories? And what I mean by that, just to give kind of maybe a practical example, there's a family, the family that in many ways inspired our latest white paper, husband and wife, each had children from a prior marriage, were really grappling with financial planning, some investment decisions, but also communication to their kids, right? How much is too much? How much do we share? How much do we give? And what they realized once we dug in through a process with them is that they had very different money stories growing up, and not recognizing that how much that was impacting them, was creating some tension. So just to be really concrete, for the wife in the family, and this was part or the early process of helping them define their values, we started asking her about how she had grown up, her history a little bit. And she said that she had grown up in an upper middle class family. But what she said was very interesting when we talked about spending is she said it was an upper middle class family, but there was a lot of volatility. When things were good, her dad was an entrepreneur. When things were great, they were great. When they were not great, they were not great. So she talked about when she was a teenager having to move out of one home into a smaller home, and just the stress. And she talked about, and it was not until we had that kind of conversation that I think, and this is what was most powerful, she said this herself, that she recognized that in many ways is what was driving her desire, her kind of inclination to have an oversized safety net, right? When they were talking about planning and investment. And it was that, and watching her husband's eyes when she was talking about that, right, was incredibly telling. On the flip side, her husband had grown up in a family. He was the eldest brother. He has one younger brother. And he talked about the fact that he was always kind of, the good son. He got good grades. He always did well. His brother had some challenges. And he talked about the fact that he always felt that his parents gave more to the brother, right? That it was not fair. And he was hypersensitive. He has one son of his own. He was very hypersensitive about how that affected his son and his new stepdaughters, right? And that had created some tension about them. And it wasn't until we started with that they both recognized, okay, this is impacting us. What is the so what? The so what is there are things about our experience that we want to keep in our new family culture, right? Kind of practices. And then there are things that maybe we want to discard. So that's just one element of it, Angelo, but that was kind of the beginning for this family and helping them create a family culture.
Excellent.
And bring in the kids ultimately.
Blended and non-blended families, I would assume, also share some common challenges, correct? Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Absolutely. We can talk all day about those.
Yes.
There are a few. I think, as you all know, I think one of the most common challenges that we see among families, among parents in particular, is really this question of how do you navigate raising children amidst wealth? How do you think about communication and gifting? And for us, this has led to a lot of client discussions, a lot of client work around kind of this question of, are there opportunities when parental overfunction can lead to underfunction of the kids, right? So are there times when you're kind of, I always say wealth, tends to smooth the corners of life, right? Whether it's one family I'm working with now where the mom was saying to me, my son has lost his soccer cleats for the 19th time and, he knows Amazon Prime will just deliver them, right? Or if it's someone who, is providing additional support in a way that maybe the young adult, is not having their skin in the game, right? So I think the first challenge, just to kind of headline it, if you will, is really kind of thinking about how much is too much. How do you think about communication and gifting? And that's really common to what we've seen with all families. And I think it's especially nuanced with blended families, because it's this question of what is the precedent, what is your reference point, right, that you're using. So that's one. The second one that we see a lot of, and we actually wrote a separate white paper on this, is what I talked about with the husband in that family, kind of this notion of fairness versus equality versus equity, right? Which is how do you as a family kind of, what are the operating principles that you're using, right? Are you just giving equal amounts? Are you supporting, is it about supporting education and somebody can get 2 PhDs, right? If one, we were just talking about where we live, if one child lives in New York, right, and is paying rent there, and another child lives in Montana, is that just what it is? Is that their own kind of self-determination decisions, or is there a desire on the parents' part to kind of help, with rent or other costs? So that's kind of the second piece. And then the third, I think, that we see a lot of is exactly to the point of just different perspectives on wealth among couples. And again, that is true across the board. We've seen it time and time again. And a lot of times those messages, those thoughts are kind of kept inside. They're not explicit. So kind of this notion of having preconceived notions can kind of create some unintended consequences.
And whether blended or unblended, kind of the question that we're in now. So it certainly applies to blended as well. And again, the area of great wealth, given my focus in the single family office community, there has to be a reason. I guess I hinted at it when I was doing my open, the old saying, I believe, made famous in America by Jay Hughes, of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. No matter, it's so relevant, no matter how much money they have. And again, it's not because they're investing in getting 3 basis points less a year. It's not that they likely don't have good tax or estate planning, although all 3 of those over time absolutely can be impactful. Why is it? What is it about blended or unblended, about the children And again, from my experience, is wealth a burden? Does it create an albatross of trying to live up to something that may be a unique dynamic combined with a little bit of luck? Who knows? That made that family business, which is commonly what it was, take off. And now you have not only a burden or perception of a burden, you have the stewardship of the family name, brand, and legacy. How do you work with your experiences with families to help them overcome not only the burden of wealth, but to be a good steward and a good person within society, broadly speaking?
Yeah, that's a great and very big question. So for us, it comes down to, you're absolutely right. And, for us, it's about complexity. And if I go to our, even the mission of our team within the center, it's to help families navigate that complexity. And I think, Angela, if you go back to the statistics, that's often quoted on shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, if we look, I remember when the statistic first came out, we as a team are much more interested in that research, other kind of research out there, why, right? And even if we stay with shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves for a second, right, the two main reasons that have been identified were kind of lack of or limited communication, and unprepared heirs or rising generation. So I would say for us, in our experience, and kind of also looking at the research kind of more broadly in the industry, for us, it comes down to, one, helping a family define what success means to them, kind of what are not just their values, but what are their operating principles, right? So we're working with one family, tremendous wealth, and the parents were really, really overwhelmed by this idea. You hinted at it earlier, but the level of wealth, they're creating multi-generational, right, trust, and just what is the impact that they're having. So one of the things that we did with them, and to answer your question, is one, helping them define what does success mean for them. For them, it means empowering their family, their children, their grandchildren, future generations to pursue what they're passionate about, regardless of how much it earns, how much money they earn. And they're emphatic about this, skin in the game, making sure that there's skin in the game for the family. Now, that is very unique to them. I'm not saying that in and of itself is a best practice, but helping them define that, that's been one. Two, creating from those operating principles kind of the actions, right? What is going to create the accountability? What are the structures? What are the governance practices that are going to reflect that, has been huge. And then lastly, the communication. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, with you and your viewers, but how critical communication is, and helping them create a system where it's not just them communicating to their adult children, but it's really creating a two-way dialogue where they're really trying to understand what are those questions, to your point, what are the feedback. Their kids have talked about, what it's like to live in the shadow, of all of that success, and kind of questions about what that means for them. So I would say, to kind of bubble it up, I would say it's the operating principles, kind of creating accountability, and creating a system of communication that's not just a one-off, that's actually a process over time.
Yes. And I would think, obviously the children and grandchildren are going to be, Maslow's hierarchy of needs are met. That's not the issue. The quality of education is, again, certainly not the issue. Although, again, the word education is funny in terms of being well educated from a school perspective is not necessarily the same of legacy, of character within the family, of adaptability, of accountability, a word that you used. Shockingly, several of the things I mentioned theoretically aren't really taught in school. They become a byproduct because we have to be accountable. But for the most part, those are all, including financial literacy. And you would think in the outside world thinks, well, all these advantages that people have growing up, blended or non-blended, in an ultra affluent family is absolutely no assurance that they're going to be financially astute or make good decisions. There's a lack of conversation among many families of great wealth, especially if they're newer to it and don't know the nuances of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, of avoiding those kind of conversations. Since your team is such a great brand and deals with over 200 families, do you help, let's call it the rising generation, to some degree learn what they're not learning in school and help them on their competency, which in my opinion is a combination of capacity and capability?
Yes, absolutely. And, the focus on the rising generation was actually one of the impetus to our group coming into being. I shared this sometimes, but I started the firm about 16 years ago. I was working in a strategy function, kind of unrelated to this. I had an opportunity about a few months into my tenure to join a meeting of our client advisory board. And it was chock full of, some of the topics, Angela, that I know, investments, macroeconomics, oil, gold, interest rates, structured products. And I share this because on the second day of that particular meeting, there was some free time, and the person organizing the meeting at the time said, we have Valerie here from the strategy group. Do you have any questions for the board? And I, at the time, selfishly, I was doing competitive analysis. I said to the group, the question that I really wanted to know is what matters most. So the question that we asked the group is, what keeps you up at night? And so many of them, they're all successful, but very different, right? In terms of background, perspective, politics, everything under the sun. And yet every person said a variation of the exact same thing. And a large part of that was thinking about the impact on their children. That's not a surprise. But I share that with you because that was a really, very sincerely kind of an aha moment for me and a few of my colleagues then. And that feedback is what inspired our very first financial education program called the Financial Boot Camp. It's a program we've been running now for 15 years, where we're focused on exactly what you said, Angela. What are the practical, actionable insights? And another piece that I feel like is also missing a lot, but I've seen kind of more, thankfully, where is the peer-to-peer learning, right? Kind of where is the recognition or the understanding of some of the concerns or the questions that, the rising generation may be dealing with? So to answer your question, we have been heavily focused on that. A big focus of our approach as a team is about experiential learning. It's kind of like, right, learning to drive a car. I mean, you could sit there and we could all read books, for a while, but it's not until you get behind the wheel. So a lot of it for us has been focused not just on the financial piece, but on the wealth piece. What is a trust? What does it mean to be a beneficiary or a trustee? The governance, how do you think about decision-making, business, if it's relevant, and then philanthropy, which is a huge focus for many of our clients, and I know many of your viewers as well.
Of course. I mean, at the end of the day, governance is, I guess, more formally defined as effectively group, or in this case, family decision-making. What process do we have? And maybe it is one person is the ruler. That's very efficient. It's very easy, but it likely is not going to lead to a multi-generational outcome in today's world that is likely going to work. You used the word a couple of times, which I like, practical. No offense, I know a lot of the brethren, and a lot of them are friends of mine in the world of family dynamics and governance. They're extremely academia, and they help to educate me. I greatly appreciate them. Probably about 20 or 30 of them are friends of mine. But there is a difference between writing in academia and practicality of implementing. I think the example that I've given in the past is I could read an amazing book about how to play baseball. It might help me a little bit, but how I get better is to actually do it and preferably have hands-on mentorship, AKA coaching, to get better, at least to the best of my quote unquote capabilities. I think sometimes academia relies too much on research and anecdotal studies, and they're very intelligent people, high IQ, great respect for them, but are they really in the trenches? I think what you're describing is a combination of deeper thought in academia coupled with the scale of the organization and your experiences with actually practical hands-on. And I think that's a big difference.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying it is. And we're, we have focused certainly on what I mentioned with the financial boot camp, that's focused on rising generation, yes, kind of 20s and 30s. One of the things that our team has been focused on the last couple of years in particular has been, the younger age group, right? Kind of what are you doing with, with young children? And certainly, I'm not suggesting to a 6-year-old to talk about a trust, but there are elements around what is the difference between a need or want? How do you think about loss, right? How do you think about your risk tolerance? Working with a family now that has, children more in that age range. I think the youngest is 5, right? Kind of the oldest is 13. And it's been really interesting. Both parents are entrepreneurs, tremendous wealth. They have kind of a family office structure that they've set up in addition to their advisor relationship, and they are passionate about entrepreneurship. And it's been this question, exactly to your earlier point. Yes, the children go to great schools. Yes, kind of they're learning the basics. But what are ways that you can get them involved? get them working. And one of the ways that we've been working with them is around the family's philanthropy and getting even younger children kind of thinking about what do they care about, kind of forcing them a little bit, kind of nudging them, right, with the right resources, but to do some research, to explain, to kind of, highlight their rationale, and then to go and see the impact. So one of their daughters is really passionate about cats. She just loves cats. And I remember asking the first time the question, what do you love? And she said cats. And, she's really focused on a local animal shelter there. They've done some volunteering as a family. And it's really kind of, again, to the analogy is put her in the driver's seat and has made her understand what's important and has shown her how the family's living the values, not just talking about them.
That's fantastic. That's actually a great example. Maybe back a little bit more specifically to blended families. You said, I believe earlier, that blending a family, if I could use that verbiage, blending a family is a process. What does that process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we observed with blended families in particular that it is not kind of a quick, right, you're coming together, you're able to make these decisions. And we've been inspired by some of the research specifically on blended families, particularly of a researcher named Patricia Papernell, who's cited as one of the kind of the top scholars in this field. And she and others have talked about this notion of with blended families, of there being a few phases with stages underneath, and kind of three phases in particular. And one, the first phase kind of being this time when blended families can sometimes have, kind of idealized expectations about what it's going to be, right? We're all going to get together. It's going to be great. And ultimately, a lot of times what they're faced with is kind of the daily challenges and the awareness that, wow, this is much more complicated than I imagined. So in the family that I mentioned that inspired our white paper, it was this notion of, wow, the kids are asking some questions about spending and, spending money. And we're trying to figure out our own retirement planning. And both of the husband and wife in that situation, which was unique, they'd both gone through liquidity events. So it was just this question of this realization, I think, for them, again, in phase one, Angela, of we have these idealized expectations. This is much more complex. Now, the second or the middle phase is really kind of talking more about mobilization or action. Here it's kind of, where the work gets done, if you will. So it's really kind of more problem solving, developing new agreements, kind of creating a foundation. So with that family I mentioned, this is where I would liken kind of what I referenced earlier, the work with the couple first, and then bringing in the children to kind of define their principles, to come up with some agreements. And then lastly is kind of, the late stage. There's contact, there's resolution. You're creating more of a family culture typically because there's more time has passed, so naturally. And you're getting the opportunity for more positive emotional bonds to build and to have this new family unit. So I don't know, you referenced Maslow earlier. I don't know if necessarily it's self-actualization, right, to be practical for most people, but it's certainly where you're moving up the curve and you've shown that you've dealt with some challenges, but you persevered.
That is incredibly important. I think in my research of billionaires, one of the things that I do, how could I say this without maybe being a little over the top, but generally before 18, going through something that was a crisis that wasn't so devastating where it could unfortunately really lead you down a path, but something that was a little bit of a wake-up call early in your life, that you do have to be resilient, that you are going to have to overcome, that even if you have money, bad things are going to happen to you and your family. That's just a reality over time of how it works out. That seemed to almost put a jolt in them, him or her, doesn't matter, that led them down a more focused, fruitful, broadly, quote unquote, successful path. Now, that's challenging as a parent. And my son's now 20, so he's a bit older. But how do you want them to go through some strife and challenges, rich or not, but not have it be so devastating where it breaks them?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And that resilience is interesting. We used an exercise that we developed a number of years ago in partnership with Money, Meaning, and Choices Institute. It's called the Value Cards. And we ask couples and families, I just did this last night with a family, with actually a blended family, to prioritize. And it's interesting to your example, there's one of the cards that we have, it's across 4 different categories, but one of the cards that we have in the value card that under kind of the lifestyle category, says we value building resilience, making life too easy by taking away strength building opportunities. And, we've had a number of individuals pick that card. I think exactly to your point, it's kind of like, how do you strike the right balance? For us, it's really tied to education and learning. And for us, we found that with families, there are really great opportunities to create kind of stretch learning, right? So for example, I'll give you a really basic example. A lot of times parents will say, I want my kids to better understand, budgeting, but it's tough. We have so many resources and, either I'm paying for them directly for something or they have a credit card. And then when I ask, how is it paid for? They'll tell me it's on auto pay, right? Or kind of the kids don't see that. So one of the things, and it's very ubiquitous, and I say this with zero judgment. One of the things that we've done with a number of families is kind of to this notion of, putting a little bit more of the onus on the rising generation family member is, to have a conversation. It's not about taking away freedom, but just saying, okay, what are the things that are important to you? I want you to create a budget, right? And I want you to kind of manage within that. If you have questions, let's try to see that. So it's this notion of, okay, and if you run out of it for these things, right, not necessities, but I don't know, an extra pair of shoes, extra coffee, you're going to have to not be able to do that because that's going to prepare you for the real world. Now, obviously, when I use the real world, that's relative when we're dealing with, significant sums of money and ultra high net worth, and you're dealing with, trust distributions. But that said, I will say, Angela, the families that have incorporated that, even those that have been very polite to me, but kind of, I could tell, nervous, I have been floored to see the way in which the rising generation has embraced so many of these opportunities. And even this notion of, you believe that I can do this, right? You're kind of giving me that responsibility. That in and of itself can be a huge vote of confidence.
Yeah, what you just described, and adults would benefit from that as well. I kind of call that a little bit in something that I teach call prioritizing, meaning you are going to have to make some decisions that are very tough. They might even be uncomfortable, and you may have to leave something out or on the cutting room floor for now. That doesn't mean that it doesn't become more of a priority in the future, but you can't, which kind of goes to the importance kind of saying no. And that goes back a little bit to discipline. Arguably, that goes back to your cognitive capability and emotional intelligence, and those become very deep issues. But if you really want to understand families of wealth and family offices, these are subjects that you need to have fluidity on. Like I started with, I think the industry has gone way too much about talking about investing. I can't go anywhere without hearing about direct investing. And I'm not discounting that. It's actually a good learning lesson about how companies work and how decisions are made. But success in a family is so much deeper. And the issues that we're describing, I actually think are not only equal, I actually think, and again, I've seen it for decades, they're more important. We're probably heading a little bit to the final 10 or 12 minutes. I do want to get through, I think, 3 very important questions. How can blended family integrate? And we hinted at this earlier, but the 2 cultures. Do shared expectations play a role in helping families work together?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it's tying a few things actually that we already touched on, which is,
right.
Excuse me, the couples, pardon me. The couples getting clarity on what is important to them as a couple, right? I think there's sometimes this inclination of, you said communication is great, let's communicate all together. And I oftentimes have to say to people, well, hold on one second, right? You have to be aligned, because I think particularly in a blended families, and I've seen this firsthand, if there's a desire to let's get all on the same page. And as we talked about at the onset, there's still, those bonds are still forming. That can also, that has the probability to kind of create more, ill than good. So for us, how can they do that, to your question of create a family culture? So one, for the couple to kind of align on what's important to them, start to create those values. 2, bring in the child or children in a way that seeks their input. Now, I think you said something earlier, Angela, about methods of decision-making. I'm really kind of big on this, and I call this kind of deciding how to decide. I find that a lot of families focus on what decision they're making, right? To your point, whether it's an investment decision, a trust planning decision. Far fewer families are clear or focus as much on how the decision is made. So the decision could be consultative, meaning the husband and wife or the two partners are making a decision and they're seeking the input of the kids. Now that's very different than let's make a unanimous or majority decision. And we have one family that we've worked with, a blended family, where the parents said, the thing that we want to do to build goodwill and kind of work together and it's true to our culture, it's philanthropy, which was great. They were doing really well. The reason when we came to work with them and the reason they were so eager to work with us is they said, we need some help. We've kind of hit a roadblock. What is the roadblock? Two of the kids are really resentful. We don't get it. We're trying to be thoughtful. The reason when we unpacked it and spoke with the kids that they were resentful is they felt that the clarity on the decision-making was not there, right? They came in thinking it was going to be X. They had a vote and they didn't. And it wasn't so much that they felt they were owed a vote. It was unclear. And they felt that perception of fairness was not there. So I would say it's the couple coming together, bringing in the communication, right? Coming up, as we talked about, with accountability on, if this is what's important to you, what are you actually practically speaking going to do? And then the last thing, maybe not tied to any of these pieces, that's maybe a little bit of surprising, but is to have some fun, right? To actually have some time to bond, to spend time together. There's so many families I work with that, have annual family meetings, kind of quarterly, it all, kind of investment discussions or what have you. And sometimes it's kind of this question of, is there dedicated time to spend together, not on any of these necessarily agenda items, but to spend time together, doing something that's meaningful for them. And it's those experiences that kind of really cultivate culture also. So I would say it's a combination of all of those things.
Excellent. Valerie, I guess I do have to ask you at least one clickbaity type question. What's the one big thing, if there is one, that will make the greatest difference?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer it. So I think the one big thing is having a one big thing. So what I mean by that is, you mentioned, Angela, prioritization earlier. We find, again, we all know, right? It's the wealth creators, whether it's second generation, third generation, what have you, we're all busy, we're all inundated. And we found that with blended families, it's really kind of the ruthless prioritization. So the couple.
You went muted.
Sorry.
There it is. It's good now. If you don't mind,
Okay.
it went mute about 10 seconds ago.
I'm sorry. No worries. I'll start over. So I think when you ask the one big thing, I think the one big thing is having a one big thing, in the sense that there are so many priorities, there are so many to-do list items. And we found that it's the families, the couples, particularly in a blended family, who identify what is the one thing that they can work on, that they will focus on. And actually focusing on it is critical. So for the family that I described that inspired our white paper, for them, it was really as simple as saying, we're going to define what are the money stories that have affected our decisions and what are the things that we want to discard. And we're going to come up with that statement, and that we're going to use to make some of these gifting decisions. So that was it. It was pretty it was pretty defined. And it started them on this road of, developing all these guidelines, communicating with the kids. But it was really, really simple, because when there's too much, we all know we do nothing, right? So it's really about just committing to one thing.
Complicated question, and we really don't have the time to deeply dive into it. So why don't we touch on it, give a compact answer, then maybe in a couple of months, we might even be able to focus a total podcast dedicated to it. And that would be, again, given my focus on larger scale families and single family offices, forgetting about the legality of structures and not needing to register with the SEC and what's qualified as an exception and married in families. That's a different discussion. But my question is, how are you seeing such families treat what I would call married into the family, blended family, when they have an existing family office, possibly with distributions from trust, and they need to mitigate risk, they need to manage if they don't want to be registered with the SEC, fitting within the proper quote unquote guidelines, let's go with the word legally, but that's all things that lawyers could deal with. But how about the more human dynamic part of it? that becomes a very touchy subject. Are there going to be the family of the wealth creator is living rich? The blended family is not treated the same. That's going to create angst. Grandchildren inevitably could be involved, and that gets to be a little bit of a thorny subject. How have you seen families now, that true blended family with single family office level wealth and possibly a single family office in and of itself or multiple? How have you seen that? And again, the quick answer, we could dive into it deeper in the future. How have you seen that play out successfully?
Yeah, you're right. It is a complex topic. I would say, I'm trying to think of a complex answer. There are different nuances there. I would say the families that I've seen navigate that most successfully are ones that are clear about understanding the guidelines up front and about communicating that. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to keep it simple here, but there's so much kind of agita or, heartburn around this that a lot of times this becomes kind of unspoken, and it's kind of an explanation when somebody remarries of, well, it's a complicated trust and there's some distributions and it depends, right? And the reality in many cases, and please disagree if you do, is in my experience when I've seen this level of wealth when there are family office structures, is some of these guidelines about what's going to whom, those have been preset by other individuals. Right. So it's not as if the individual party that's marrying, is making that decision. So I think one, clarifying this is what exists. Two, understanding this is how it's going to be. But then three, asking the question, this goes back maybe to the estate, attorney or who have you, are there ways to then provide maybe for members of the new blended family, right, distinct and separate from those assets, right? Are there distributions that can be then used for other planning? And recognizing that is really, really important. Now, it's obviously harder, and I'm dealing with this, working with a family now where there are 5 children kind of combined, right? And it's true, 2 of them are being dealt with very differently. But the reason they're being dealt with very differently is because the grandparents set up certain structures, clarifying that it was not against anyone, they were not even in the picture, and then trying to understand what are the categories that are most important to the family. For example, education, some additional kind of support. And how can they come up with a strategy? So it really comes down to, I think, understanding oftentimes what can be a very complicated set of structures, one, and two, honesty about this is what it is and this is how we're going to tackle it.
It just popped in my head. Have you seen a blended family coming into marriage and being at that point a blended family, and then that couple ends up having a bloodline child together? And now it started off as a blended family. It still is, but it creates another unique set of dynamics. In the example you gave of trust generationally that were set even prior, now the bloodline of that descendant with the person who came in as a blended family, now that bloodline is probably within the trust auspice and structures, but not necessarily the others. I mean, you would agree with me. We could see areas where that might create some friction.
Absolutely. And yes, I would say it's interesting that you asked that. A number of the, I'd have to look to see what percentage, but a number of the blended families that we've worked with have that dynamic, right? So it's, let's say they married younger, or whatever the case is, where there is a child that they had together, right? So there's a child and kind of half siblings. I would say in those cases, again, it's kind of it depends. One example that I'm thinking of, you're absolutely right. It's the daughter. They came together. They each have 2 children, and they have a daughter together. Very close family, very collaborative. And it took a lot of work. I will acknowledge, with their private wealth advisor and their estate attorney. But the kid, the youngest, is now in her late 20s. Of being clear, these are structures that were set up. There are 2 other parents in the fold, right? So being respectful of that. But then saying to your earlier question, we are our family, our blended family. This is what's important to us. These are the plans that we have made. And yes, some families seek to normalize, if you will. But again, even the word normalize is based on someone's perception of fairness. So I think that's kind of a critical element.
And I believe my last question, then we'll go to a close. Do you have any tips or tricks on encouraging and facilitating communication? Maybe that's the key word, between members when asking important financial, or I guess I could argue even non-financial decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two things that come to mind. I usually have three, so this is a shocker. But I think one is starting with the why. Starting with the why. I think it's so easy, and I've seen this time and time again. It's not surprising, perhaps, for the viewers, your experience, I know, I imagine you'd agree. Successful, thoughtful people are kind of busy, right? They want to get things done. So there's this kind of predisposition, I think, in terms of decision making of, let's make the decision about gifting. Let's make the decision about planning. Let's make the decision about the donor advised fund. And yes, it's important. Those things are critical. The tax efficiency, all of those elements. And yet, my team and I have found time and time again, the people who skip over the why does the trust exist? I can't tell you, Angela, how many times I've asked a client, what is the purpose of this trust? And the response I get is a definition of a trust. The trust is to protect against creditors and divorce. Great, right? And again, you're absolutely right. What is the purpose of this trust specifically for you personally? And the reality is many people don't know, not because they're not organized, but because for a lot of people, the planning is done in a way where you're trying to be tax efficient, you're trying to be, timely. You haven't thought about it. So I think the why is really critical. And the other thing is kind of just echoing what I said earlier, because I'm so emphatic about this, deciding how to decide. Clarity of how you're making decisions. It doesn't mean that you have to have unanimous, voting on things. But it's being clear about how you're making decisions. We see this a lot with philanthropy. Something that is so meaningful and good to so many people can sometimes take a turn, right? If it's not clear what is the point of this in terms of our decision making, in terms of the roles and responsibilities. So those are two, Angela, I would say, kind of the why and the deciding how to decide.
Well, thank you, Valerie. I really enjoyed our dialogue. We left some things for kind of a part two in the future in a variety of different topics, but this was a very good, let's call it beginning. I look forward to more upcoming in the future. Tell us a little bit about the Merrill Center for Family Wealth. Do you work with individuals, families, through advisors, through the single family offices? Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And likewise. So our team is a specialized unit within Merrill Lynch, that works with about 200 families. To your question, we do work through the private wealth advisors at the firm. We're a value-add service to the top clients, and we focus on a few different areas. We focus on actionable insights. So we publish a fair amount of research and thought leadership around all of the questions that we hear on a daily basis from families. So blended family is a good example of that. We were peppered with questions. Fairness versus equality, gifting, communication. So that's one element of our work. Another element, huge element of our work, is learning and rising generation, particularly empowerment. And then the last kind of piece that takes up the majority of our time, is facilitating family meetings. So kind of family discussions among families. So those are kind of the three big pieces. And to pick up, Angelo, kind of my final comment to your earlier comment on your observation that this area can be sometimes, as important or sometimes even more important than the financial piece. My team and I feel so gratified to do this work because there's so many times where I've seen that, wealth is obviously tremendous and can create opportunities and challenges. But I think for most families, I've yet to meet a family that is not really curious of how can they really create well-being, right, for themselves, for their family members, and ensure that all of their hard work, all of the success doesn't create unintended consequences. So for us as a team, our mission is really to help families navigate complexity and create purpose, productivity, and fulfillment for them.
Our special guest today again was Valerie Galinskaya, and it is spelled Galinskaya. Valerie, for those that would have an interest in reaching out, how would they do so? And maybe if you have a LinkedIn, if they could follow, if they could get white papers, research, or would they need to go through a private wealth advisor at Merrill Lynch?
Absolutely. So if they're interested in viewers and looking at our thought leadership, they can reach out to me. I'm happy to share. As far as engagement with our team in any of our resources, kind of capabilities, learning, or facilitated family meetings, they would need to have a relationship with an advisor. So that would be kind of the next step there.
And I'm getting a little old-fashioned with the verbiage that I use. Pardon me. That would be Merrill Private Wealth Management more formally. In my
Yeah.
quick wrap up and conclusion, it was a pleasure to interview Valerie. Again, it's a subject that I think is very important for families that already have, that was a key word, already have great wealth, however you may define it. This is the most important subject. Areas pertaining to family, pertaining to governance, how decisions are made. And if you ask the wealth creators that are already wealthy, usually they may use different words, but it comes down to what's their purpose is family continuity, their legacy and wealth beyond financial, but that's an important part of it, being passed down, having children and grandchildren that are good stewards, and their impact in a positive way on society. And all the things we spoke about today, given that about half of all families are blended, could complicate certain matters. So it was a wonderful discussion. Hopefully you all had a chance to learn something. I know I did. And everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. And for those of you that are becoming more familiar with my new platforms, very briefly, many of you know me more as being the longtime founder and CEO of Family Office Association. I had an exit earlier this year. I wish the new ownership group nothing but the best. I had a chance to recharge my batteries, and I'm very excited about the work that I'm doing. And this is more of my media and interview arm, which I love to do. My more private work is through SFO Continuity and Family Office Masterclass, which are deep, very immersive educational platforms for families of great wealth, and even specifically best practices within the family office and private consulting that I do on creating or reimagining what I call into a top 1% single family office. I'm active on social media. You can find me, and I'm at angelorobles.com. Valerie, it's been a tremendous pleasure having you on the show. I very much look forward to next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you.